Welcome to Reformed Thinking. So, um, imagine standing on the very edge of the Grand Canyon for the first time.
Oh, wow, yeah. That is quite a visual.
Right. The wind is hitting your face, and the sheer drop stretches down into these shadows you cannot even measure. The red rock just spans out for miles until it blurs into the horizon.
It is completely overwhelming.
It is. And you pull out your phone, you dial a friend who is sitting in a cubicle somewhere, and you open your mouth to explain the scale of what you're looking at. And then your vocabulary just breaks.
Words just entirely fail.
They really do. You try to use adjectives like big or massive, but they sound ridiculous compared to the reality. You might snap a quick photograph and send it over, but you know the image falls entirely flat.
Yeah, a photo doesn't capture the vertigo.
No, not at all. It doesn't capture the silence or the sheer scale. The undeniable reality of the thing entirely escapes our standard human descriptions.
Which is a brilliant way to frame our topic for today.
Thanks. Today, we are looking at a historical text where a man hit that exact same wall. But he wasn't looking at a canyon. He was trying to describe the sheer scale of the divine.
Language hits a hard limit when we approach the infinite. We are left grasping for comparisons, trying to map an incomprehensible eternal reality onto our very limited everyday experiences.
We use shadows to describe the sun.
That is beautifully put. And the text we are unpacking today takes that literal idea to its absolute limit. In 1871, a man named Charles Haddon Spurgeon stood up in London and took on the seemingly impossible task of putting words to the majesty of the Christian gospel and the person of Jesus Christ.
Really have to set the scene for a moment here, because this is not just a quiet essay written in a dusty library.
No, not at all.
This is a sermon titled The Son of Righteousness. Spurgeon is speaking at the Metropolitan Tabernacle in London. And if you look at the historical context of 1871 London, you're dealing with the absolute height of the Industrial Revolution.
Right. The smog, the factories.
Yeah, it was a city choked by coal smoke. The sky is frequently this bruised, smoggy gray. The air smells like sulfur in unwashed bodies.
It was a very gritty, very grounded reality for the people sitting in those pews.
And in the middle of this massive, dark, churning industrial machine, Spurgeon stands up before an audience of thousands without a microphone, mind you.
Which is still wild to think about.
I know. Using only the sheer volume of his voice, he points them to the brightest, most undeniable object in our sky to explain the force of the gospel.
He builds his entire argument on a specific text from the book of Malachi, chapter 4, verse 2, right alongside the brilliant imagery of Psalm 19.
The result is a staggering piece of rhetoric.
It really is. He recognized that finding the right words leaves us speechless. So he bypassed standard theological jargon and grabbed a physical object that every single person in that room, from the wealthiest industrialist to the poorest chimney sweep, understood on a visceral level.
He created a detailed mechanical comparison between Christ and the Son.
He did.
And unpacking Spurgeon's central metaphor is the mission of our deep dive today. We are going to look at this specific framework and show how it clarifies history, how it illuminates Scripture, and how it directly affects your own personal faith when you wake up tomorrow morning.
That is a big mission for one deep dive.
Okay, let's unpack this. We have to start where Spurgeon starts, which is looking up into the high heavens. He establishes his justification for this solar metaphor right out of the gate.
He does, and his justification is based heavily on human limitation. He points out that if you possessed all the wealth of the physical universe, you would give it away.
Right, like if you held galaxies of gold and entire planets made of diamond in your hands.
Absolutely. You would gladly give all of it to honor the Redeemer. But since we do not possess that kind of cosmic wealth, and since our descriptive words constantly fall short, we have to look for the absolute best available shadow of his glory.
And the sun is the most glorious, influential, and abiding object in our physical creation.
Spot on. It dictates the seasons, it sustains all biology, and it commands the sky. Therefore, it is the best, albeit still faint, shadow of the Lord.
He introduces this phrase from the Psalms describing a tabernacle for the sun, and he applies it directly to Christ.
Yes, the tabernacle concept is huge here.
He argues that Christ is not a phantom. He is not a dream. He is not a mythological figure. And he is not just some historical teacher who lived in the first century, died, and faded into the pages of a textbook.
That is a very common modern misconception he was fighting even back then.
Spurgeon argues that he is a massive, living reality today, dwelling in the highest heavens, canopied by the adoration of his saints.
The canopy imagery requires a bit of historical translation for us today, I think.
Oh, for sure. Unpack that for us.
Well, in the ancient world, kings did not just walk down the street to the market like regular citizens. When a monarch moved, they made pompous progresses through their dominions.
Like massive parades.
Yes, huge spectacles. They were surrounded by glittering soldiery, musicians, and heralds. And most crucially, they had gorgeous, ornate canopies borne aloft over them by their attendants.
So the canopy was like a massive visual marker.
That is it. The canopy signaled to everyone watching that the person underneath it was the absolute center of the pageant, the center of authority. Spurgeon uses this historical reality to say Christ is doing this right now across the universe.
He is traversing the heavens in a majestic tabernacle, scattering beams of light among men.
Precisely.
I struggle with this starting point, though.
Really? How so?
Well, my instinct, and I think the instinct of most people who grew up in or around the Christian faith, is to start the story at the cross. Or maybe we start in the manger at Christmas.
Sure, that makes sense.
It feels much more relatable, much more human, to start with a baby in the dirt or a suffering man on a piece of wood. Starting the narrative by looking up into the high heavens at a reigning monarch feels a bit disconnected from our daily ground-level reality.
I can see why it feels that way.
So what does this all mean for the listener right now? Why does Spurgeon refuse to let us start on the ground? Why must we begin with a reigning Savior?
What's fascinating here is that Spurgeon possesses a very sharp understanding of human psychology and the mechanics of faith. He knows that human beings need leverage.
Leverage, like an engine to keep going.
Exactly that. We need an engine. A living, ruling Christ provides the necessary leverage, what Spurgeon literally calls the fulcrum for our faith.
Oh, I see.
If you start with a defeated figure, or if you start with a purely historical figure who is locked in the past, your faith has no present engine. It has no current heat.
That makes total sense.
If Christ is not reigning today, in this very moment, with the keys of universal monarchy at his side, then the rest of the sun metaphor entirely collapses.
Because the sun is not a historical fact. You do not wake up and read about how the sun used to shine back in the days of the Roman Empire.
No, you don't.
The sun is a present, active, aggressive reality hitting your skin right now.
Yes. He is not a weary figure resting after a long, exhausting ordeal. He's actively reigning, anticipating the moment when all enemies become a footstool. That shifts your entire mental perspective.
You are not looking back over your shoulder at a fading memory.
Right. You are looking straight up at a blinding, present reality. A historical event from 2,000 years ago might give you a nice moral lesson, but it does not give you the active, burning heat required to get through a tragedy today. You need a sun that is currently in the sky.
That makes the stakes very high right from the opening paragraph. You are dealing with an active force.
You really are.
But to understand how that sun got to its high position, Spurgeon moves chronologically. He takes us back to how this sun first appeared to humanity, looking at the beginning of its daily course.
And he uses such vivid language for this part.
The text describes the sun coming forth as a bridegroom coming out of his chamber. This is a spectacular shift in the imagery. We move from a cosmic king in a tabernacle to a bridegroom stepping out of a hidden room.
He links this idea of the bridegroom stepping out of a hidden chamber directly to the incarnation. This is the moment Christ takes on human nature.
And he frames this specifically as a marriage alliance, right?
Yes, he does. We have to look at the political history of how wars were settled to grasp this. When two massive kingdoms were at war in the ancient world, the final way to establish lasting peace between the warring parties was almost never a paper treaty.
Because paper treaties get broken, the second one side gets strong enough.
Absolutely. The permanent solution was a marriage alliance. The royal families intermarried.
Because once the bloodlines are mixed, you cannot easily go to war without attacking your own family.
That is the core logic. Heaven and earth were divided. They were alienated. Humanity was in a state of rebellion against the divine.
The Prince of Peace, to unite these two warring factions, actually married our human nature. He took human flesh upon himself, permanently binding the divine and the human together.
But before the bridegroom can burst forth in glory and celebrate the union, he spends time in the chamber.
This chamber concept is fascinating.
It represents the hidden, veiled portions of Christ's existence. Think about his earthly life. He was hidden in plain sight.
Yeah, he spoke openly in the streets of Jerusalem. He walked the roads of Galilee, but he remained largely unrecognized by the world at large.
The political and religious establishment did not discern their king. He was veiled in humanity. His majesty was muffled.
It makes me think of the mechanics of a seed.
Oh, how so?
Well, if you want a massive oak tree, you do not just throw an acorn on the sidewalk and yell at it to grow. You have to bury it.
Right, it goes into the ground.
It has to sit in absolute suffocating dark before it breaks the soil. The darkness is a biological requirement for the life to begin.
That is a great way to look at it.
And Spurgeon takes this chamber concept even further. The chamber is not just his quiet life working as a carpenter in Nazareth. It represents his descent into extreme suffering and eventually the grave.
The grave is the ultimate dark chamber.
I see the logic, but practically, the idea of a bridegroom going into a tomb seems entirely counterintuitive to a wedding. Why did the bridegroom have to go into the dark? Couldn't he just declare peace from the heavens?
He had to go into the dark because his bride was in the dark.
Oh, wow.
This touches on a core tenet of the theological tradition Spurgeon is preaching from, which views humanity as entirely fallen and subject to the penalty of a broken law.
Right.
The bridegroom had to bear the sicknesses and the massive shame of his church. Humanity was subject to death. We had fallen under a heavy, crushing yoke.
So he couldn't just stand far off.
No, to be a true bridegroom, to truly execute this marriage alliance, Jesus could not stand on the outside, look down from a pristine cloud, and shout instructions on how to be better people.
That would just be a king giving orders. It wouldn't be a marriage.
Precisely. He had to descend into the lowest parts of the earth. He had to take on the exact penalty his bride owed. He bowed his head to the stroke of death to complete that marriage union perfectly.
He slept among the dead. The dark chamber of the tomb was a strict legal and spiritual requirement.
It was the only way to secure the bride.
But the tomb is not the end of the metaphor. A chamber is something you eventually walk out of.
And Spurgeon has this incredibly vivid imagery of what happens next.
He does. He describes the sun withdrawing the veil of night, pulling back massive curtains of purple and vermilion, and flooding the earth with fluid gold. The dark chamber was just the necessary prelude to an absolute explosion of light.
The coming out of the chamber happens in 3 very distinct historical phases, and tracing them shows the sheer momentum of this event.
Okay, let's trace them. What is the first phase?
The first phase is Easter morning. The stone was rolled away, the angels descended, and the enigmas that had confused the disciples for 3 years were suddenly instantly clarified.
Because they had been so confused.
Very confused. The disciples had been stumbling around in the dark, failing to understand his parables, failing to understand why he had to die.
But when the high priest stepped out of the tomb in his robes of glory, the sun crested the horizon. The dark was over.
For 3 days, those disciples honestly thought the sun had burned out. They thought the universe had gone cold.
That must have been terrifying. Then we hit phase 2, the ascension from the Mount of Olives.
Spurgeon paints this majestic picture of angelic bands poised in midair.
Yes, holding their collective breath, waiting to welcome the captain of the host back to his ancient patrimony. The sun ascends above the horizon to make his glories stream along the heavens.
And then the third phase is where the heat actually hits the ground.
Pentecost.
Yes, the Spirit is poured out. At first, you have to realize the chamber was geographically very small.
Palestine was the chamber.
Right. Jesus had looked wistfully toward places like Tyre and Sidon, but the light was contained within a very specific set of borders.
But at Pentecost, that containment breaks. The light bursts through the clouds. It hits Parthians, Medes, Elamites, dwellers in Mesopotamia, Egypt, Rome, and eventually reaches what Spurgeon calls the Northern Isles.
Referring to Britain itself.
Here's where it gets really interesting to me. We usually talk about Pentecost in terms of the rushing wind and the tongues of fire. We treat it like a supernatural fireworks show.
We do tend to focus on the spectacle.
But connecting it to this specific solar metaphor entirely changes the mechanism of how you view it. Receiving and giving gifts at Pentecost equates to the sun's rays actually taking root inside the people they touch.
It is not a passive event.
No. The light isn't just something you stand outside and observe. It doesn't just warm your skin. It becomes active inside the observer.
This answers the core question of why this matters at all. The light of the gospel is entirely self-propagating.
Explain that a bit more.
Well, when the Apostle Peter stood up to speak to the massive crowds in Jerusalem on the day of Pentecost, it was actually the bridegroom speaking through him. The sun's rays were hitting Peter, entering him, and illuminating the crowd.
You can visualize those disciples waiting in that silent upper room. The chamber is completely quiet. They are hiding.
Just waiting.
Then the sudden rushing wind and the immediate visible effect of that light hitting the dusty streets of Jerusalem. 3,000 new believers are created in a single day.
The heat creates life instantly.
So if Pentecost proves that this light creates life the absolute second it hits the ground, we have to ask a mechanical question. Does it sustain that energy?
That is a great question.
A meteor creates a massive flash of light when it hits the atmosphere, but it burns out in seconds. Does the bridegroom's light burn out, or does it endure?
To answer that, Spurgeon shifts the imagery slightly, but he stays within the solar theme to describe the daily path across the sky.
What does he compare it to?
He notes that the sun runs a race like a strong man, and the defining characteristic of this course is strict unity.
Unity of direction.
Yes, the sun does not wander around the sky trying out new directions. It does not pause to reconsider its trajectory. It has an unyielding, fixed path. Christ has never retraced his steps.
He has never revised his doctrine, and he has never changed his tactics.
Spurgeon says the gospel has the dew of its youth. While false systems crumble or become paralyzed over time, the gospel stays fresh.
He takes some massive swings at other systems here to prove his point. He talks about the idolatry of Hindustan being worm-eaten through and through.
And the machinations of Rome being paralyzed at the heart, knowing their time is short.
We should probably unpack those specific references, because to a modern listener, they might just sound like random historical insults.
In the context of 1871, the British Empire is mapping and colonizing large portions of the globe.
Right, the empire is expanding.
They are encountering ancient worldviews, like the vast, complex pantheons of India, which Spurgeon refers to as Hindustan. From his perspective, these ancient systems are decaying. They do not have the life-giving heat of the sun.
Simultaneously, back in Europe, there is intense political and theological friction with the Roman Catholic Church.
The machinations of Rome.
Yeah. Spurgeon views these systems as either structurally decaying or politically desperate. He contrasts their perceived institutional panic with the gospel, which retains its calm, morning vigor.
He pairs that critique of ancient systems with a very sharp attack on the new intellectual movements of his day, too.
Oh, he mocks the human craving for constant philosophical novelty.
He really does.
The late 19th century was flooded with new ideas, higher criticism in the universities, new rationalist philosophies. People love to announce fresh discoveries in thought.
But Spurgeon calls these new ideas broken images of heresies that our fathers dashed to pieces centuries ago.
He compares these modern thinkers to buyers of old shoes.
That is such a grounded, working-class analogy.
It really is. He says they buy old shoes, patch them up, and sell them as brand new. Old shoes and clouded, he calls them. Clouded meaning cobbled together.
Right, patched up.
People bring out these supposedly new, brilliant philosophies, and Spurgeon points at them and says, no, we have seen those shoes before, and they still have holes in them.
If we bring that into the 21st century, it is what we see in the modern self-help industry.
Oh, absolutely. How many times have we seen someone write a best-selling book that just repackages ancient stoicism, slaps a minimalist font on the cover, and sells it as a brand new lifestyle hack?
We are constantly buying patched-up shoes.
Well, you are.
The human mind is easily bored, so it constantly seeks out the novel. But Spurgeon reveals a massive confidence in the fixed nature of truth.
The course of the sun does not need amending. You do not need to update the sun's software. It worked perfectly 1,000 years ago, and it works perfectly today.
That is a very reassuring thought.
I see the logic, but from a purely historical view, the church has seen massive shifts.
It has been a bumpy ride, historically speaking.
If you look at the last 2,000 years of church history, it looks incredibly messy. We see splits, denominations fracturing into hundreds of pieces, massive moral scandals, and drastic changes in how churches operate and engage with culture.
That is all true.
How can Spurgeon stand in London and claim the course never alters when the ground-level reality of the church looks like a chaotic maze of changing paths?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, we have to draw a hard line between human institutions and the core gospel.
Okay, unpack that distinction.
Spurgeon separates the institutions of men from the central truth of Christ's work. Human structures fluctuate wildly. Denominations rise, splinter, and fall. Massive stone cathedrals crumble or get turned into tourist museums.
I've walked through a few of those museums.
Right. But the core work of Christ saving sinners, substituting himself for the guilty and glorifying God, remains as fixed as the sun's trajectory. The sun does not stop moving just because a building on Earth collapses.
It is the difference between the meteor and the sun.
Yes.
A shooting star flashes brilliantly across the sky. It dazzles everyone looking up for about 2 seconds, and then it hits the atmosphere, burns out, and dies in the dark.
That happens to so many human movements.
Human institutions, political empires, or those patched-up novel philosophies are like meteors. They are highly visible for a short time. But the morning sun provides a steady, continuous warming presence that never burns out. It just keeps running its race.
And running that unyielding course requires immense strength. The text says, "He rejoices as a strong man to run a race."
Notice the physical posture there.
Yeah, he does not pant or creep up to the starting line, sweating and exhausted before he even begins.
He surveys the entire course of human history, knows he is entirely equal to the massive task, and bounds forward.
He overcomes everything in his path: dark clouds, pagan persecution, papal edicts, and even what Spurgeon specifically calls the dense spiritual deadness of modern times.
He dashes on with undiminished energy. And this brings up an emotional disposition that I think we often entirely miss when talking about the divine.
Which is?
Joy, joyful strength. Spurgeon cites an analogy from an old Welsh preacher to explain this specific type of joy.
It is a striking image. It is about a mother washing her baby's dirty face.
The child has been playing in the dirt and is covered in grime.
The mother takes a rough cloth and begins to scrub the child, wanting its face to shine. But the baby absolutely hates the process.
The baby cries. It struggles, it whines, it flails its arms around, because from the baby's limited perspective, all it feels is the present discomfort of the rough cloth and the water.
It just feels the friction.
But the mother does not start crying with the baby. She keeps singing while she scrubs. She does not share the child's sorrow because she possesses something the child lacks.
She knows the end result.
Yes, she knows she's producing a clean, shining face.
The child only feels the immediate friction. The mother sees the guaranteed future.
If I'm listening to this while driving to my job and I'm stressed about the economy or I'm dealing with a chronic illness in my family, hearing that Christ is rejoicing like a strong man might honestly feel a bit alienating.
I completely understand that reaction.
I feel the friction every single day. I open my phone and the news is a chaotic mess of discomfort and pain. How does his joy actually help me in my current anxiety?
It helps because it changes the framing of your suffering. Human weakness brings sorrow, but divine strength begets joy.
So, he is not just happy while we are suffering.
No, Christ is purifying his church. He is washing the dirt off. The friction you feel is not the chaotic spinning of a universe out of control. It is the deliberate scrubbing of a sovereign hand.
He sings while he works because he sees the end from the beginning.
Spot on. He is not wringing his hands, anxious about the state of modern politics or the economy.
He knows the outcome is mathematically secure. Spurgeon uses the image of the earth swathed in morning mist to drive this home.
It is a very helpful mental picture.
To someone standing on the ground, enveloped in a thick fog, the sun seems entirely obscured. The world feels cold, gray, and depressing.
You can't see past your own hand.
But from the sun's perspective, looking down from the high heavens, it is shining gloriously and unimpeded. The mist does not affect the sun's heat or its joy in the slightest.
And because of this unstoppable strength, because of that unimpeded heat, the effects of the sun reach absolutely everywhere.
That brings us to a crucial mechanical phrase in the text.
There is nothing hid from the heat thereof.
The heat of this sun penetrates the deepest, darkest places on earth. Spurgeon mentions the deepest mines, where miners hundreds of feet below the surface can still somehow feel the effects of the solar cycle.
And he applies it directly to the lowest haunts of London's vice.
Keep in mind, 1871 London had vast slums, rampant poverty, and absolute misery.
Spurgeon is saying that the darkest, most wretched corners of society are not exempt from the heat of the sun of righteousness.
The heat operates in two distinct ways, right?
Yes. First, it brings life. Spurgeon talks about the heat eventually resurrecting dry bones from the grave, pulling life out of sheer death.
This ties back to the Reformed understanding of irresistible grace. The light creates life where there was none.
But secondly, it brings severe accountability.
For those who reject the light.
Yes, the heat still affects them. It becomes a savor of death unto death. No one gets to stand in a neutral zone. You are either melted by the heat or you are scorched by it, but you are not ignored by it.
The absolute sovereign reach of Christ means no one is exempt from his influence. He rules in providence over all people, whether they acknowledge him or not.
And this provides massive encouragement for a person to take action in the world without fear.
If there is nothing hid from the heat, there is no physical or cultural place you can go where Christ's authority is absent.
Spurgeon gives this incredibly aggressive encouragement to everyday Christians based on that fact.
He tells them, "Go there, for you are not intruders." He tells them to walk right into the darkest settlements, to face the vilest blasphemer, because they have a sovereign right to be anywhere in their master's dominions.
This raises an important question about territory.
How do you mean?
Well, if the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof, then there is no territory on this planet where a Christian is trespassing.
You are never sneaking behind enemy lines into land that God does not own.
The enemy might squat on the land, but he does not hold the deed. Believers can face the harshest critics or walk into the most intimidating cultural spaces because the Son of Righteousness already legally owns the ground they stand on.
Imagine a dark, freezing cave that has been shut off from the world for centuries. It is damp, it is cold, and things have evolved to live in the pitch black.
Very creepy visual.
The moment the sun's heat hits the entrance, the entire dynamic of the cave changes. The creatures inside might scramble away from the light. They might absolutely hate the sudden rise in temperature.
But the sun does not stand at the entrance and ask permission to shine into the cave.
It simply changes the physical reality of the space by its mere presence.
Recognizing this universal authority, this absolute heat that nothing can hide from, forces a massive shift in how we arrange our theology and our daily lives.
You cannot just tip your hat to the sun and walk away. You have to mechanically orient everything around it.
Which brings us to a massive structural shift in how we view the universe. Let's call it the Copernican shift.
Spurgeon insists that Christ must be the central sun. You look at the history of religion, and you see people constantly trying to put other things in the center.
Spurgeon warns that you cannot put man in the center. If you make the gospel entirely about human potential, human will, or self-actualization, it leads to massive error.
The mathematical system breaks.
He also warns against putting specific theological doctrines in the center. He specifically names the doctrine of election.
Let's define election here to understand the weight of this warning. In the Reformed theological tradition Spurgeon belonged to, election is the teaching that God sovereignly chooses to save individuals based entirely on his own grace, not on any foreseen merit in the person.
It is a weighty central doctrine for his congregation, yet he warns them.
If you put election in the center, you make a one-sided system. He is telling an audience that cherishes this specific doctrine that elevating any concept, even a true one, above the living person of Jesus breaks the entire system.
He applies this warning to the structure of the church as well. Christ must be the center of the church. No dynamic pastor, no historical bishop, no pope, and no specific church government model can occupy that middle space.
He is the center of world history, which explains the rise and fall of political empires better than any sociological theory. And most crucially, he must be the center of your own heart.
I want to talk about the astronomy here because the history of how we understand the solar system perfectly maps onto human psychology.
Let's look into the history of Ptolemaic astronomy.
For centuries, following the model of Claudius Ptolemy, astronomers tried to map the stars, assuming the Earth was the fixed center of the universe. They operated on a geocentric model.
The problem was, when they tracked the planets did not move in perfect circles around the Earth.
Sometimes a planet like Mars would appear to slow down, stop, and move backward in the sky, what we call retrograde motion.
Because the math was a nightmare. To make an Earth-centered universe work, these ancient astronomers had to invent all these bizarre looping orbits called epicycles.
Circles spinning within circles just to explain why Mars was acting weird.
The entire system was incredibly fragile and logically confusing. Nothing lined up naturally.
But the moment Nicholas Copernicus and others later proved a heliocentric model, putting the sun in the exact middle suddenly, all the chaotic math worked.
The need for those bizarre looping epicycles vanished.
Everything made logical, elegant sense because the heaviest, brightest object was providing the gravity.
And this perfectly mirrors what happens in our lives. Humans naturally prefer tangible systems we can control. We like to put our careers, our political affiliations, or our specific church rules in the center of our mental solar system.
But when you put your career in the center, your life becomes a math nightmare.
You have to invent psychological epicycles to deal with the anxiety when your career stalls. You have a massive theological breakdown when a church leader falls, because you have them in the center instead of Christ.
A solar system only functions when the massive object is in the middle. If you replace the sun with a smaller planet, the gravitational pull fails entirely and everything spins out into the dark.
You understand history, scripture, and your own daily anxieties properly, only when you realize they must revolve around Emmanuel, God with us.
When Christ is in the middle, the looping, confusing orbits of your life finally make sense. The gravity holds.
So, with the sun rightly positioned at the center of the universe, the center of our theology, and the center of our hearts, there's really only one practical thing left for a person to do.
Spurgeon tells us we must bask in the beams.
Basking sounds incredibly passive. It sounds like laying on a beach towel while on vacation.
It does sound that way, but Spurgeon outlines highly practical, vigorously active ways to do this. First, you must mockily realize he lives.
Not as a historical figure on a timeline, but as a present reality today.
You must constantly recall that fact against the barrage of daily distractions. Second, you must lay your soul beneath his influence. This involves an active daily swap.
You swap your guilt for his atonement. You swap your weakness for his strength.
It is an active, deliberate transfer of burdens. Spurgeon says, all I am, he's taken to himself, and all he has belongs to me.
That is the mechanism of substitution.
Yeah.
That is not laziness. That is a vigorous act of faith, taking your inadequacy and throwing it straight into the furnace of his perfection.
Third, Spurgeon says we must imbibe the joy of his strength. We have to stop fretting over ritualists who peddle what he calls the stale tallow of past ages.
That specific phrase, the stale tallow of past ages, contrasts so sharply with the fresh heat of the sun. Tallow is rendered animal fat. It was used to make cheap, foul-smelling candles for people who could not afford beeswax.
Spurgeon is saying, why are you sitting in the dark worried about people lighting cheap, smoky, foul-smelling candles when you have access to the noonday sun?
Laugh the enemies of God to scorn. Defy the darkness because the victory is mathematically sure.
And fourth, we are commanded to reflect his light.
This is where I push back a bit, or at least ask for clarity on the mechanics of it. How does a regular person realistically reflect this light in a world that feels incredibly dark?
It is a fair question.
You watch the news, you deal with illness, you see institutional decay. Are we supposed to somehow generate our own brightness? Are we supposed to manufacture a fake, smiling optimism to light up the room? Because I do not have the energy for that.
Spurgeon uses the analogy of the planets to answer this, and it provides a vital distinction. A planet generates absolutely zero light of its own.
Mars, Jupiter, Venus, they're just massive dark rocks floating in space.
They do not manufacture an ounce of brightness. They simply refuse to conceal the light they receive from the sun. They bounce it back into the dark.
So reflecting light is not about my own energy levels. It's not about my own forced optimism or trying to act like everything is fine when it isn't. It is simply about positioning.
Precisely. It is about where you stand in relation to the source. And Spurgeon adds a crucial detail. The fork that gives you the light will travel alongside the light you reflect.
You are not just bouncing a visual beam to make things look pretty. You are transmitting the actual heat and authority of the sun to the people around you.
I picture a dying candle trying to keep itself lit in a windstorm versus a massive mirror simply angling itself toward the noon sun.
The candle is exhausting its own limited resources, burning itself down to a puddle of wax, terrified of every single breeze.
The mirror expends zero energy.
It simply stands fixed, facing the right direction, and it blinds anyone who looks at it. We are called to be the mirror, not the candle.
Basking in the beams means angling your life so directly toward Christ that his light bounces off your actions, your words, and your peace, illuminating the people around you. You do not manufacture the heat, you just stubbornly refuse to hide it.
Okay, let's pull all of this together because the sheer scale of this metaphor is massive.
Right.
We've traced the sun from its high tabernacle in the heavens, establishing the fulcrum of a reigning Christ right now.
We watched the bridegroom descend into the hidden, dark chamber of the grave to secure a legal marriage alliance with a humanity that was stuck in the dark.
We saw that light burst forth on Easter morning, expanding outward at Pentecost to hit the furthest isles and create life in the streets.
We observed the sun running an unstoppable race through history, ignoring the patched-up novelties of human philosophy and outlasting the decay of human institutions.
We saw the joyful strength of a Savior who sings while he scrubs his church clean, possessing a heat that penetrates the deepest minds and the darkest corners of human society.
And finally, we saw how placing this sun at the fixed gravitational center of our lives, throwing out the complicated epicycles of our own egos and our own rules, allows us to actually bask in his beams.
We swap our weakness for his strength and act as mirrors in a very dark world.
It leaves us with a final thought to mull over, building directly on the physical realities of the solar system. We talked about being a planet designed to reflect the sun's light. In astronomy, we know how an eclipse happens.
An eclipse occurs when one celestial body slides directly in the way of another, completely blocking the light.
Take a hard look at your own orbit today. Are there things in your life, fears, lesser priorities, anxiety about the news cycle, or even well-meaning theological systems that have slid into the path?
Are you allowing temporary things to create an eclipse, blocking the heat of the Sun of Righteousness from reaching the exact areas of your life that need it the most?
That is the question to sit with.
What a mechanical, haunting question to leave on. The light is constantly shining. We just have to make sure we aren't standing behind a rock. Thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive on Reformed thinking. Keep looking up, keep adjusting your orbit, and we will catch you next time.